Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and highly critical macroeconomic analysis by Dr. Jamal Abdul Rahim titled Collapse of the Dollar Myth. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides or endorse a specific worldview. Instead, we're going to objectively examine the author's arguments regarding global financial systems. We'll be taking a very close look at how modern currencies are structured, diving into the history of monetary policy, and, crucially for this explainer, really focusing on exactly why the famous 1944 Bretton Woods system ultimately failed. It's a deep dive into the very architecture of global wealth, so let's just jump right in. The author actually frames his entire thesis around two central questions that are, well, absolutely vital to understanding modern economics. First, how exactly did the US dollar manage to dominate global trade so completely? And second, perhaps more importantly, why did the initial gold-backed system that secured this dominance inevitably collapse? Dr. Rahim argues that understanding this massive historical shift is basically the skeleton key to understanding today's global balance of economic power. To get there, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the rise of the dollar. Then we'll deeply analyze our main focus, the reasons for collapse. After that, we'll hit the Nixon shock, the petrodollar era, and finally, the alternative currency. All right, Chapter 1, The Rise of the Dollar and Bretton Woods. The text details how the United States emerged from World War II with an economy vastly stronger than the war-torn nations of Europe and Asia. I mean, the U.S. held immense industrial power and a massive chunk of the world's physical gold reserves. So, picture this. July 1944. 44 nations gather in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for a truly defining moment in financial history. The author notes that instead of creating a neutral global currency, the U.S. leveraged its new superpower status to institute a system where global currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and in return, the U.S. dollar was strictly pegged to physical gold. Simply put, the U.S. essentially became the world's central bank, mostly because it was the only major player left standing with a functional industry and vaults completely overflowing with gold. $35. That single number was the anchor of this entire global agreement. The U.S. committed to exchanging dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. It wasn't just a metric, right? It was a psychological bedrock. According to the author, this specific guarantee meant a paper dollar was trusted exactly the same as a heavy physical bar of gold. It cemented absolute power, turning what was just a local American currency into a borderless, globally trusted reserve asset. But the text argues the U.S. didn't stop there. The author asserts that initiatives like the Marshall Plan, which, provided massive financial aid to rebuild Western Europe, were not just acts of post-war charity. They were highly strategic geopolitical moves. By offering long-term loans and grants exclusively in U.S. dollars, the U.S. effectively locked European economic recovery into its own monetary system. The text suggests this ensured a lasting financial dependence and established American dominance over the recovering continent for decades to come. Which brings us to our main focus today, Chapter 2, Reasons for Bretton Woods Collapse. So why did a system specifically designed to bring global financial stability completely fall apart by 1971? Well, the author outlines 5 specific compounding pressures that broke the gold-backed dollar. Think of these as 5 massive cracks in the foundation. First up, the text notes the incredible economic recovery of Europe and Japan. As they rebuilt their industries, they became powerful economic players again, and they really bristled at being entirely subservient to U.S. monetary policy. Second, the socialist bloc was actively resisting integration. They were building their own alliances, creating immense geopolitical friction. Third, you had the sudden rise of oil-producing nations, particularly in the Middle East. They were generating massive revenue, and the text argues this threatened to drain U.S. gold reserves if they suddenly demanded physical gold instead of paper dollars. Fourth, internal American policy. The author argues the U.S. had this growing desire to just print currency without the restrictive anchor of physical gold holding them back. And finally, the fifth crack, and honestly the heaviest blow, the massive costs of the Vietnam War and America's ballooning trade deficits. To fund these staggering expenses, the U.S. was simply printing way more paper money than it actually had gold in its vaults. The math literally just stopped working. Recognizing this overprinting, some nations decided to test the system's integrity. And the text highlights a wildly tense historical anecdote here. In 1968, French President Charles de Gaulle basically called America's bluff. He formally demanded that the U.S. convert France's stockpiled paper dollars back into physical gold at that $35 an ounce rate. And he didn't just want a polite bank transfer. France literally wanted ships filled with physical gold sent back across the Atlantic. This bold move completely exposed the vulnerability of the U.S. reserves. It became painfully clear that the U.S. simply didn't have enough physical gold to satisfy everyone if a global bank run happened. And that undeniable pressure triggered Chapter 3, the Nixon shock. Facing the imminent depletion of its gold, the U.S. government had to make a drastic, unprecedented choice. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a unilateral announcement that sent absolute shockwaves through the global economy. He halted the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Now, the author characterizes this not as some strategic financial triumph, but as a forced escape from mounting U.S. debts. It was a sheer inability to honor the fundamental promise of that 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. To really grasp what happened next, we gotta look at the mechanics of the shift. Pre-1971, under the gold standard, money was a literal representation of a physical asset. But post-1971, we entered the era of floating exchange rates. Without gold, currency values were suddenly determined purely by faith and market demand. Imagine a currency operating kind of like a company's stock. If people don't actively want or need to buy it, the value plummets. The author notes that while this freed the U.S. to print money to cover its deficits, it created a highly volatile global market where the dollar's strength relied entirely on ensuring continuous global demand, rather than any intrinsic physical worth. This desperate necessity to manufacture continuous demand leads us directly to Chapter 4, the petrodollar era and floating. So once the gold anchor was gone, the U.S. needed a new strategy, right? They needed to ensure the world still desperately needed to hold American paper. The author points to the creation of the petrodollar. This is a global framework where international oil sales are priced and purchased exclusively in U.S. dollars. The text argues that tying the world's most vital energy resource to the dollar was a deliberate, highly calculated strategy by the U.S. to sustain global reliance on its currency, even without a single ounce of gold backing it up. The author breaks down how this strategic pivot happened in 3 distinct phases. Step 1, as we saw, was severing the gold connection to escape immediate debt and a catastrophic gold drain. Step 2, according to the text, was applying geopolitical pressure and striking complex deals with OPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, to ensure all oil was priced in dollars. And Step 3, that's the inevitable result we see today. Virtually every nation on Earth now has to hold massive reserves of U.S. currency just to buy the energy they need to keep their lights on and their industries running. But Dr. Rahim doesn't just analyze the past. He proposes a path forward in our final chapter, the alternative digital currency. To counter what the book describes as Western economic hegemony and the looming threat of financial sanctions, the author proposes a pretty radical alternative. He advocates for the establishment of a unified Arab and Islamic digital currency. According to the text, this currency would be managed by a newly formed central union bank, entirely separate from Western financial institutions. By pooling their massive sovereign wealth and natural resources under one centralized banking system, the author argues these nations could bypass traditional Western clearinghouses, insulate themselves from the weaponization of the U.S. dollar, and achieve true economic sovereignty. Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As geopolitical tensions rise across the globe and nations increasingly seek ways to bypass the dollar-dominated system, we have to ask, can regional sovereign wealth and newly proposed alternative digital currencies truly protect developing nations from global financial hegemony in the 21st century? It's a complex, continuously unfolding puzzle. But as the author shows us, understanding exactly why Bretton Woods failed in 1944 is the absolute first step to seeing the bigger picture. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. And as always, keep questioning the systems that run our world.